On June 15, 1937, the Times correspondent in Istanbul wired the news of a full-fledged military operation to Dersim, a loosely defined region on the Taurus Mountains with peaks reaching up to 3,000 meters in eastern Anatolia, a land unknown to most of the readers. The headline that was rather celebratory and eye-catching read, "Kurds who object to education, a revolt suppressed by troops." To substantiate this statement, the reporter referred to Prime Minister İnönü's speech at the parliament the day before, where he framed the rebellion in Dersim as one against compulsory education and other reforms introduced by the Republican regime. The last paragraph of the short article was reserved to 22-year-old Sabiha Gökçen, one of the adopted daughters of Mustafa Kemal, who had earned the world's first female war pilot title by taking part in the aerial bombings. After praising her for having shown bravery and resources throughout the operation, he concluded the piece by claiming that she had dropped the final bomb, which virtually put an end to the insurrection. Indeed, Gökçen, whom we have recently learned, was possibly one of the Armenian orphans, removed children of the genocide, bombed and machine-gunned Dersim for over a month, targeting, in her own words, I quote, "anything moving," hitting at least once hundreds of civilians who were fleeing their villages to take refuge in caverns with a 110-pound bomb. Unlike what the reporter claimed, however, Gökçen's bombs were not the end. Dersim remained a muted matter until 2010. But based on the state's own documents, we now know that there was no insurrection or rebellion either. Instead, in Dersim, the young republic carried out its most comprehensive and disruptive military operation, which lasted over 2 years and claimed the lives of 14,000 Dersimlis out of a population around 60 to 70,000 people. Multiple observers mentioned that chemicals had been used, especially against the women and children who were in the caves. Official documents indicate that a total of 21,000 people, both dead and alive, were labeled as rebels. Thousands were sent into exile, and hundreds of children were removed from their families. However, local sources estimate a higher human toll. But why, then, this talk of education? Can an operation of this scale be about introducing or resistance to compulsory education? Did the Kurdish groups in general, Dersim in particular, resist education? If this was solely about Turkification or being Kurdish, why were other Kurdish regions spared such genocidal moves? At the most fundamental level, what were the connections established between education and the nation, the military operation and the schools in the Republic's solution to the Dersim question? In recent years, abundance of critical works have flooded scholarship on early Republican period, touching every matter, ranging from secularism to nationalism, minorities, gender, cultural policies, and economy. Of course, there are studies like Professor Kezer's and Professor. But education and schools, however, remained a noticeable outlier in this flourishing literature. In the public, as well as among large body of scholars, there is more or less a consensus that, despite some unpleasant practices, Republican education policies provided an almost equal footing for the structural disadvantage, an opportunity for upward mobility, help soothe social stratification, especially gender gap, urban, rural, and class divide. Out of the ruins of a nepotic, divided, backward empire, according to this narrative, Republican policies have stood out as more about social justice, meritocracy, enlightenment, and modernization. More importantly, perhaps, there is an insinuation that, yes, they were aimed at constructing a nation, but at the end it achieved welfare and were in the best interest of the children in particular and society in general. Especially the myth of self-sacrificing Republican teachers who devoted their lives to fighting against the darkness of ignorance by educating the future generations in the wilderness, sustained that education was reserved to the civic and civil matters of the state, embodying its compassionate, constructive, and nurturing nature, which makes thinking about schooling in terms of a violent genocidal policy integral to military operation rather difficult. So we don't really have the kind of discussions scholarship on settler colonialism had about genocide, education, welfare, and interest of the child. Even critical left in Turkey has embraced and promoted some of those policies as their own, since many of them came out of these institutions themselves. In the highly divided Turkey, two main groups have been critical of the early education policies. First is the religious conservative groups who resent secularization, the closure of traditional educational institutions such as madrasas, and in their stead establishment of village institutes which were co-ed rural developmentalist schools which aim to radically transform the countryside by inculcating the future generations in the know-how, music, hygiene, etc. Second group is the ethnic minorities, most notably among them Kurds, who, like the reporter himself, argued that the Turkish nation has aimed to assimilate all the Kurds by taking them to schools, and in response, Kurds tried to preserve their identity by resisting it. I must note an irony here, otherwise incongruent positions, that of the official state and the Kurdish nationalist narratives, do converge when it comes to Dersim and the education issue. Here I would like to make 2 points that are often missed. Actually, 2 myths that enable this convergence. First is the resistance to Turkifying education. Unlike what has been stated in the Times article, and unlike my generation, Kurdish nationalists of late Ottoman and early, my generation, Kurdish nationalists of late Ottoman and early Republican period did not oppose education, and even if it were to be given only in Turkish. To the contrary, they saw absence or rather withdrawal of schools as a tool of discrimination that Kurds were subjected to by the new regime. Both Celaleddin Ali Bedirhan and Nuri Dersimi, 2 prominent Kurdish national leaders who had gone through imperial school systems, pointed out a shift in Republican policy regarding the Kurds after the Sheikh Said Rebellion of 1925, whereby the Turkish state abandoned the policy of assimilating by education and preferred not to open up schools in the Kurdish regions. Bedirhan argued that love of homeland is same for all races. Through Turkish books, young Kurds were learning about the necessity to love their motherland and to be proud of their nation, rather than being assimilated into Turkishness. Similarly, Dersimi claimed that Turkish state not only banned schools and Kurdish culture and language, but also prevented Kurdish youth from continuing their education in high-level Turkish schools. On the reverse side of this argument, and the second myth, is that the Turkish nation state wanted to assimilate all the Kurds without any distinction by education at all times. However, if one looks at the debates among the Republican elite at this time, the picture is more blurry. There is a consensus that all the difference should be assimilated into Turkishness, but in the case of Kurds, largest ethnic minority left after Lausanne, the major controversy among them is whether assimilation should be done by schooling or not schooling them, and who among them needs to be assimilated first. Several reports written in this period attest to the fact that in dealing with Kurds, increasingly there was a language that underlined the colonial dynamics and preference for not education. So after this long introduction, I would like to go back to the Republican solution to Dersim and why there was so much emphasis on education in this case, especially that of the girls. In the 1930s official discourse, Dersim was a religiously heterodox, ethnically non-Turkish, mountainous land often characterized by savagery, dubious loyalties, and treacherous liaisons. Foremost, Dersim was the sacred center of Kurmancı and Zazaki-speaking Kızılbaş, a religiously non-conforming group with dubious links to Islam. Attributing mythical powers to Dersim's arduous landscape that hosted various holy sites which provided them refuge during previous military operations, Kızılbaş not only transgressed newly drawn boundaries of rational state religion, but also defied state's image as the omnipotent and omnipresent in these unruly highlands. Such defiance was perhaps most evident during the Armenian genocide of 1915 and 17, when Dersim Armenians mostly survived because they didn't face exterminations at the hand of their neighbors, as had been the case in many other Kurdish regions. To the contrary, Kızılbaş groups provided refuge and even helped local Armenians escape across the border to safety, in some instances for truly altruistic reasons, and in others simply to make money, further strengthening the conviction that Dersim was treacherous. With such ambiguities, it was a constant source of anxiety and high priority issue for the political elite of the new nation. Beginning in 1925, a team of professional and non-professional ethnographers, civil and military officers appointed by Ankara government worked for an appropriate plan for resolving the Dersim question. This plan solidified in 1935 and was enacted under the Tunceli law, baptismal name of Dersim. It entailed a two-stage strategy that will be launched with a military operation and ensued by the implementation of a structural transformation plan, also termed as a dahili colonization, internal colonization, by famous General Staff Marshal Fevzi Çakmak. This plan stipulated first a demographic reorganization of the region through deportations of the troublesome tribes, followed by the settlement of reliable elements, and finally an acculturation scheme for the redeemable ones, which was also labeled as a civilizing mission. The long-fought war on assimilation through schooling or not schooling, and an alternative game currency. According to General Özmen, who was the general inspector of the first inspectorate, in order to absorb them in Turkish, a boarding school modeled after missionary schools, whereby the children's eating, sleeping, speaking habits would be separated from his or her parents for 3 years, was the only solution. Although not fond of providing education, General Staff Çakmak also proposed that girls above a certain age could be educated. In the early days of the military operation, a circular sent by Minister of Interior Şükrü Kaya to Gendarmerie in June 1937 with the subject line, "Educating the girls and boys of Dersim in boarding schools." In the circular, Kaya declared that children above 5 should be educated in boarding schools located in a district that was away from Dersim, densely populated by Turks as a part of the reform movement. After their graduations, these children were to be married to each other and establish Turkish homes in the lands they had inherited from their parents. In explaining why Dersim required such extreme measures, Kaya's circular also revealed how the Republican elite created new taxonomies of race out of several reports on Dersim's treachery, ambiguity, and unorthodoxy. According to the report, Dersim needed decisive intervention, not because it was Kurdish, as Diyarbakır or Hakkari, but because it essentially was one of the earliest Turkish settlements who preserved Turkish ethnic for centuries through its shaman-like Kızılbaş tradition, but developed hostility against the Sunnis and Ottoman Empire as it is represented. To them, main irony was that these genuine Turks, whose hostility to the state was for protecting Turkishness, were now being Kurdified due to evil tribal chiefs who expanded its power after the Armenian genocide and were reinstating a medieval feudal-like regime in Dersim. In this, mothers of Dersim were Kurdified earlier than the fathers, since men had contact with the outside world, while the women lacked access to it. Therefore, they could not acquire the Turkish language and could pass it to their children, which perpetuated alienation from Turkishness. An epitome of what anthropologist Apudi Wright calls anxiety of incompleteness, Republican elites viewed Dersim as a tainted state of being, which failed to fit into the eligible categories of identity.
As such, it was a constant reminder of incompleteness of Turkishness, the bold but unsubstantiated claim upon which the new Turkish state founded itself. Thus, in the Kemalist elite's fantasies, rather than being Turkish or Kurdish, Kızılbaş or Sunni, it was this process of in-betweenness that called for a radical solution. So, Fevzi Çakmak repeatedly stated that Dersim could not be won over by compassion and had to be treated as a colony until the desired elements were removed from the area and the Kurdification process could be reversed. Thereby, they were not only justified, but also obliged to annihilate anything that was remotely related to this process of Kurdification to save the Turk. Simultaneously, they had to carry out compassionately colonial civilizing schemes that would transform those who were not yet fully Kurdified. So, kill those who can't be saved, and those who are redeemable needs to remain and go through a, civilizing scheme. So, in that respect, rescuing the rising generation became fundamentally important for this genocidal project. Following the circular, Şükrü Kaya's circular in the fall of 1937, Abdullah Abdoğan, the commander of the military operation in Dersim, issued an order requiring every village to bring at least one girl to the police station or gendarmerie to be taken to a school in Elazığ. And I think Zeynep is going to talk a lot more about that, so I leave the Elazığ part. This unusual order was regarded skeptically. Dersimlis were used to frequent recruits made for their sons for the military service, but this was the first time political authorities demanded their girls. Also, besides these masculines that I opened my talk with, there were news that the girls had been forcefully removed from their families, and we now know it's actually reality, and we don't even know the number of girls that were forcefully removed and given to the soldiers and members of the military and others. And some of them were married off, some of them we don't know what really happened to them. So that the girls would be sent away to a school caused additional concern to families who feared that, whatever happened to those girls who disappeared might happen to their own daughters. However, saying no to Abdullah Pasha at this point was not a viable option for the families. So they basically sent their daughters to an unknown future. So Elazığ Girls Institute was the final destination of the girls recruited by the soldiers from the homes, villages, and mountains of Dersim. A boarding section was added to otherwise regular Girls Institute at Elazığ. In the first year, the school had 28 girls. During this period, slippage between the educational and military operation was at its peak, and the soldiers did all the recruitment for the school. Even if the families were willing to send their daughters to be educated, the girls had to be handed to the soldiers in the villages. Since the purity and protection of the woman from foreign hands symbolized the chastity of the group, both the state officials and Dersimlis understood that they were surrendering as they gave their girls to the Turkish soldiers. Recruitment process often turned into means of punishment inflicted on families who were not massacred or exiled but were not seen as fully compliant with the regime either. A striking example was 20-year-old Güllü, who was captured and brought to school by the soldiers on her wedding day. Beside those girls whose families had to give consent, there's this big thing about consent. There were orphans who were brought directly from the operation district and who had witnessed the execution of their families by remaining under the pulse of dead relatives for days. Some still bore the physical marks of the bullets on their bodies, and others physiological scars of the military operation. However, education at this boarding school was a privilege, a marker that they were not rebels or Kurdifiers, thus redeemable back to Turkishness, right? So the school registry attests to the fact that the school was only a temporary station for a number of girls who were orphaned or forcefully removed from their families before taken away. So those ones that I marked yellow, and I had a very brief access to archives that's being gathered at the parliament after the Erdogan's kind of strange apology. And there I had a chance to see the registry book of the school. And those I marked with, the yellow, they are probably, removed children removed from their families, since their parents' name and those who brought them to school are fundamentally different, and it seems like they were just there until they are given to a family. So it was really, they were not considered redeemable. They were not considered worthy of getting an education, and they were there until, a family claims and takes them away. So, the school was really a continuation of the military rule established in Dersim, and Abdullah Pasha was the higher officer of the school just as he controlled Dersim. In one of the interviews he gave, Abdullah Pasha listed his selection criteria for the girls as follows. When I selected these girls, I look for the qualities. She shouldn't be the daughter of an tribal chief or the daughter of a slave. She should be the daughter of a farmer, and that's also considered one of the qualities of a Turk farmer. One of the common people who owns and controls his house. The daughter of a family who has a house, land, and who is not known to be rebellious or slavish. Right. So, how was the life at school for these girls who were brought from Dersim? In the first 2 years during the military operation, the school was simply a mechanism to pacify the rebels. It was a 3-year program where the girls were immersed in Turkish and had to complete citizenship, national security, math courses, cooking, housekeeping, child care. But at the end of these 3 years, they were given a document for completion of the program, which wasn't equivalent of a primary school diploma. Thus, the goal here was not to provide an upward mobility, as it's often claimed or attributed to Turkish education model, but just to subdue and train them for skills that might be useful for creating Turkish homes, right? The principle regarding the education of the girls were laid down and employed by Abdullah Pasha. He often visited the school, which was very close to his headquarters, and made sure that the school was run on military discipline. The girls greeted not only Inspector General, but their teachers also with the martial salute. So if you look at here, these are, again, from the registry book. So this was a regular girls' institute. So there was only a section. So if you look at these, different, coming from all different kinds of social strata and different walks of life. So teachers were also, didn't necessarily have connection to this region. So the teachers who were supposed to educate and discipline these girls delegated their responsibility to the janitors who were employed from the local poor Sunni, people, and who didn't hide their disdain for the girls, whom they often called tailed Kurds or mountain bears. Upon their arrival, the janitors took care of the welcoming ceremony, which included isolating and sanitizing the girls' bodies and clothes. One of the interviewees recounted her arrival to the school with her sister and cousin. I quote, "They isolated us for the first 3 days in a room. We did not know Turkish. The janitor was coming and checking our hair. If there were any lice, the hair would be shaved. They checked our heads. They were clean." I talked to a number of women who, went to this school and in the earlier generations. And each of them mentioned how their hair and bodies were checked, but hair was particularly a touchy issue. And none of the girls admitted that their hair was cut or shaved. But if you look at this, again, the registry book, and they did a funny registration model. So the first line of every, there are two sections. First line of every section corresponds to the same year. The second one corresponds to the same year. So if you look at the first generation of students, they are all with the, shaved hair. So it looks like not many people really escape, not many girls, escaped, shaving off the hair, but no one really wanted to admit that their hair was shaved. We know most of these details thanks to Sıdıka var, who volunteered to work among the girls of Dersim, divorcing her husband and leaving her only biological daughter with the father. There is indeed quite a helpful literature, maternal colonialism, that came out of Australia, United States, and discovers how white women opened up a space for them in the colonial project by claiming their maternal capacities, but not using them simply for their own biological offsprings, but offsprings of the nation or those who needs to be redeemed. So we see a unique example of that, I guess, in the case of Dersim, right? So Sıdıka var wrote her memoirs where she focused on the 20 years she spent at Elazığ Girls Institute as the director to the section on girls of Dersim, and published them under the title My Mountain Flowers, in reference to Dersimli girls picked from wild mountains. Sıdıka var recounted that the first thing she had noticed upon her arrival at the school was these boyish-looking girls walking around with these haircuts and begging her not to send them back to village looking like boys. Although the founding of the boarding section... How am I doing time wise? 2 minutes? Okay, I'll try my best. Preceded her arrival, it was her intervention which moved away from the conventional duties of a teacher to the metaphors and methods of motherhood, and earned her a rather unusual reputation, Turkish missionary, that nurtured this unique example of Republican civilizing mission. Under her supervision, 1939 till 1959, Elazığ Girls Institute became what a governor called a civilizing factory, where the wild-natured, poorly dressed, stubborn, ill-tempered girls who lacked a language, dil bilmez, became well-mannered, congenial girls who chirped in Turkish and served coffee to the guests. History of the school, as well as its relation to Dersimlis, came to a turning point with the appointment of Sıdıka var, who actually, really earned her title, her reputation as the Turkish missionary. And, for those of us who are doing work on missionaries, there are always this before and after photos. And she actually kept the records of every student that came to that school. And, she took pictures of them when they first arrived and documented their progress. So on her way to Elazığ, just after she left her daughter, she said, "We have to assimilate a group with respect to its traditions, rituals, and appearance. We are facing a necessity to understand our ideals today, to work knowing that we have a mission to struggle for making love Turkishness by making them love us, and to respond every reaction with goodwill." So, after she arrived, she forbid, mentioning Kurdishness, since these girls were essentially Turks, the real, genuinely Turks. Beating and other stuff was also forbidden, but so was speaking Kurdish. But unlike, many other bureaucrats or teachers working in the region, she did something quite smart to kind of smoothen the relations ease the tension between the local populations and the school. And she decided to learn Kurdish, although she never let children themselves speak Kurdish. And she says that, when I asked in the learning process, she occasionally asked them help with some Kurdish words. And she said, when I asked the meaning of a Kurdish word, when there was a need for a translator, they were denying their knowledge of the language and getting away with it. They seemed to be ashamed of knowing this language. However, the fourth general inspector had prohibited the use of Kurdish as an insult. Right? So, like again, the residential schools in United States and other settler colonial experiences, Avar thought all the girls were ignorant of hygiene issues, they were ignorant of Turkish language, and only girls could learn Turkish and other courses only after acquiring basic hygiene. And, and then they were supposed to learn cooking, ironing, sewing, sewing, and childcare. And these were all, of course, part of being initiated into Turkishness, into being proper Turkish mothers. So again, I mean, this school was not established to provide these girls as as an opportunity for upward mobility, but Sıdıka actually did something unexpected, and with her negotiations with Abdullah Pasha, she's made possible that these girls could be transferred to village institutes, which enabled them to become school teachers. Several of those girls who went to this school, went through this residential schooling experiences, at the end ended up teachers who would go back and work in Dersim. And most of the interviews I did actually was with these women who became teachers. So I was wondering whether they became what the, Republican elite in 1930s imagined, right? Emissaries of Turkishness, the seeds of Turkishness going back to Dersim. Interestingly, they were speaking Turkish without an accent, and their home looked like any Turkish teacher house, quite orderly. And but when get to know each other, they said that as early as 1950s, they became activists themselves and joining to Kurdish cause earlier than perhaps many others in their generation. And quite interestingly, their children were also active political activists. I knew one of them was a Kurdish feminist, the other ones a leftist who served long jail time. But I met by chance one of their students. I interviewed just one student that was, educated by these mountain flowers. And he also became a Kurdish nationalist, quite interestingly. So none of people who went through this education ended up being Turkish nationalists. But she remembered his teacher with anger and almost hatred. When I asked why he was so angry with her, he said, I confronted her years later. I said, I'm going to forgive you for all the beatings you did when I was a naughty boy, but I don't forgive you for beating me for speaking my mother's tongue. So in a way, these processes of, acculturation, assimilation, and colonization never works the way it's intended. There are always unintended consequences. And we know that Dersim particularly was not an easy place to, subdue or bring under authority. And it's still one of the, if you look at the education statistics, I think Tunceli, Dersim's new name, is with the highest education rankings at the nationwide exams, at the general statistics. But again, in 1990s, when the Kurdish war was yet another peak point, again, Tunceli was remembered as a place that a new kind of civilizing mission done through education needs to be done. And this time, again, somebody like Sıdıka appeared and again started a project. I have a daughter in Tunceli. She will become a teacher. Thank you.